Hi, welcome back to Daniel. In the previous weeks, we have looked at the history of the exiled Jewish people, specifically 4 young men who were plucked from a life of prestige into a world of servitude under a foreign nation. While the training taught them their new life, the 4 resolved to place their hope and their faith in their God, recognizing God was with them, no matter whether they were in Judah or in Babylon, and they would worship Him alone. At the end of their training, the 4 were recognized as outstanding in their assessment by the king, and God had gifted them wisdom and knowledge. This week, we're going to have a look at chapter 4. A bit has happened since we last left Babylon. Daniel is serving in the king's court. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have been appointed administrators over the province of Babylon. But it's not the story of these guys I want to touch on this week. Chapter 4 of Daniel is a bit of an oddity, as it is mostly penned by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. There is some speculation whether or not this was King Nebuchadnezzar or another king called Nebuchadnezzar. Apologies for the pronunciation. However, the jury is still very much out with this suggestion, and in the meantime, Nebuchadnezzar is the name we are given in the text. The chapter is also not an edict announcing a law, but more of an open letter from the king, utilizing poetry in the beginning and the end sections to convey his message. So let's get into it. Daniel chapter 4, verse 1. To the peoples, nations, and men of every language who live in all the world, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are His signs, how mighty His wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures forever, generation to generation. King Nebuchadnezzar addresses this letter to all the world. What is incredible is that this is only a slight exaggeration. At the peak of Babylon's power, they had conquered all the known world. They had stripped other nations of their might and power and had used them to strengthen Babylon's position. Nebuchadnezzar himself was a great military leader, as well as political master. His kingdom was the known world. There are very, very few people who have been able to achieve this level of power in history. Yet here he is, the most powerful man on earth, promoting the kingdom and dominion, which is sovereignty or rulership, of God. Prior to chapter 4, we see that Nebuchadnezzar does recognize God. Yet here we have the most powerful man on earth promoting the kingdom and dominion, that is the sovereignty or rulership of God. Prior to chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar does recognize God. We see it in Daniel 2 verse 47 and chapter 3 28 and 29. Yet it was still in his construct of a pantheon of gods, some more powerful than others, and more importantly, his perception of his own greatness was still able to function while paying lip service to God. So what happened? From verse 4. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, content and prosperous. I had a dream that made me afraid. As I was lying in my bed, the image and vision that passed through my mind terrified me. So I commanded all the wise men of Babylon to be brought before me to interpret the dream for me. When the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners came, I told them the dream, but they could not interpret it for me. Finally, Daniel came into my presence, and I told him the dream. We'll jump through to verse 10. These are the vision I saw while lying in my bed. I looked, and there before me stood a tree in the middle of the land. Its height was enormous. The tree grew large and strong, and its top touched the sky. It was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant. The beasts of the field found shelter, and the birds of the air lived in its branches. From it every creature was fed. In the vision I saw, while lying in my bed, I looked, and there before me was a messenger, a holy one, coming down from heaven. He called in a loud voice, "Cut down the tree, and trim off its branches, strip it of its fruit, and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it, and the birds from its branches, but let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground in the grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man. Let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times 7 pass for him." The decision is announced by messenger. The Holy One decrees the verdict, so the living may know that Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men, and gives them to anyone he wishes, and sets them over the lowliest of men. Straightforward, right? Okay, so we have a messenger, we have a subject, we have an action, and we have a reason. The Holy One is the messenger. The tree is the subject and has the mind of a man. The action is the tree is cut down. And the reason is that we will all know that God is sovereign over all earthly kingdoms. What we also have is an interpretation supplied by God through Daniel. But what I also find interesting is Daniel's reaction to the dream. From verse 19 we read, "Then Daniel, also called Belshazzar, was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him. So the king said, 'Belshazzar, do not let the dream or its meaning alarm you.' Belshazzar answered, 'My lord, if only this dream applied to your enemies and its meaning to your adversaries.'" There was a physical impact of the meaning of the dream on Daniel. It is possible he was scared to be the bearer of bad news, but there seems to be a level of genuine concern and compassion by Daniel towards Nebuchadnezzar. This is a king that took over his country, who was going to kill all the wise men, who threw his friends in a fiery furnace, and yet there's concern. If we jump down to verse 27, we even see that Daniel instructs the king, "Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed." Daniel doesn't promise a change of future, but implores the king to change his ways in recognition of the truth of the message. God alone is sovereign. What an act of humility. But before I get too far, let's go for the interpretation. From verse 24. "This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High has issued against my lord the king. You will be driven away from people and live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes. The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules." King Nebuchadnezzar is in a place where he considers himself higher than any other person. And to be honest, with what he achieved, it's easy to understand how. He is clothed in entitlement and pride based in himself, though, and his efforts alone. There is no room for anyone else other than himself on his own pedestal. In contrast, we have Daniel, who is able to look at his captor and, void of self-interest, display compassion. So we fast forward a year, and has there been a change? No. For a little bit of the text, we switch from first person to third person. From verse 28 rather. "All this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, He said, "Is this not the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my might and power, and for the glory of my majesty?" His might, his glory, his majesty. He had well and truly exalted himself beyond human standing. Verse 33. Immediately, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from peoples and ate grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. This time of exile for Nebuchadnezzar was to be 7 times, which could mean 7 months, 7 seasons, 7 years, or even none of the above. We're not certain. Whatever the term may be, it concluded with the acknowledgement that God the Most High is sovereign over all the kingdoms. We return to the first person as Nebuchadnezzar recalls. At the end of the time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes towards heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. The language of Nebuchadnezzar has changed. Rather than my glory, it's now God's glory. You get a bit of an impression that Nebuchadnezzar is a bit of a work in progress with the language he uses in the rest of the text, like verse 36. At the same time, my sanity was restored. My honor and splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. But he also concludes with verse 37. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right and his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. The conclusion of Nebuchadnezzar's life remains hopeful but also ambiguous. We are not sure if Nebuchadnezzar went back to his old ways of self-glorification or humbled himself enough to know and recognize the ultimate power, God, who deserves all the glory. We just don't know. Chapter 4 gives us a glimpse of the life of Nebuchadnezzar, but the main point of the chapter is God alone is sovereign. He deserves all the glory, and he alone sits on the throne of heaven. Whether you are experiencing someone who is on a power trip or you yourself are having a power trip, remembering that God is the true King can both encourage and humble us. This also leads into our fragility. Nebuchadnezzar, who was the most in control, secure person anyone could be, he quite literally sat on the throne, but he also did figuratively in his own mind as well. Had it all. He owned his own army, his wealth was great, he was at the top of his game. Yet even he lost it all. His security in himself, his control over his kingdom, did not save him from the crash he had. Nebuchadnezzar had a big reality check, confronted by his own fragility and mortality. Confronting who we are as humans, our fragility and mortality, can even out our pride in humility. As we see in the later verses, Nebuchadnezzar did not balk at this. He embraced the reality check of his own mortality and fragility and praised God who did the right thing in his circumstances. With the grace of God, we can use this as a check for ourselves. What do we prioritize? How is our ego going? How are we going in humility and compassion? In the same way, we also need to take stock of where we place our hope, or where we even believe we have control. Have we placed ourselves on the throne of certain aspects of our life, or all of our life, where only God deserves to be and only God can be? Believing we are the source of X, Y, and Z is pride. where we believe no one else can do it better, or I deserve this because, is pride. The inability to think beyond ourselves, whether negatively or positively, is pride. Where is our pride at the moment? And lastly, God intervened into Nebuchadnezzar's life. Nebuchadnezzar was not from Israel, yet God still placed people like Daniel in his world to bear witness to the truth of who God is. He also extended the opportunity to Nebuchadnezzar to come into a relationship with him, to recognize that God is the one and true sovereign God, and he is gracious to his creation. So that is chapter 4. There is a lot in there, and there are some challenging questions I think we can continue to ask ourselves, even for the rest of our lives. But for now, I pray as you work through some of these questions in your group, God's grace will be upon you and the conversations you have.